So it's just for me to welcome you all again, and particularly the people new who weren't with us yesterday. And Brian, I imagine you want to welcome everyone as well.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm not going to say good morning because it's not good morning for many of you, but it's really nice that those of you come back again for a second day, and a warm welcome to those who are joining. And we had a very lively day yesterday, and we're going to summarize that in a second or two.
Yeah, so we just thought we'd just give you a flavor of what happened yesterday, particularly for those people who weren't with us, so that we're all kind of joined up. So we started, I suppose myself and Brian just gave a little bit of background on the book and how we came to write the book and what it consists of. And largely what it consists of is sections that are related to the workshops that you're going to be in today. Only got one choice of workshop each day, but the themes around research, around training, around work with families, service development, and comparison with other approaches, that's what makes up the workshops. I wrote the introductory chapter to the book, and in my presentation, my keynote yesterday was really just to start to introduce the approach to you, and in particular focusing on the 7 principles of open dialogue. And I might as well mention what those 7 principles are. So it's immediate help, social network perspective, including the social network. If I can put them in order: responsibility, being responsive, tolerating uncertainty, dialogism, flexibility and mobility, and psychological continuity. So those are the 7 principles, and I went through those in some detail, and also introduced some other principles that for me are important about the approach. We then had a panel who reflected on the presentation, and I was able to respond to the panel before we had some questions from the floor. And what I'm remembering now when I think back to the panel reflections is how many people focused on how much common sense there is in this approach. And there was a sort of an invitation to, well, I suppose some of the panelists were saying many aspects of this approach, resonate with my practice, having practiced for, quite a long period of time. And some people have attempted to try and introduce some of these aspects in services and met various challenges along the way. So there was an invitation there for us people developing open dialogue to learn some of the lessons and look at what's happened elsewhere, and to learn from each other. And that's one of the reasons why we have a panel of people from beyond to bring their perspectives, and we'll have the same again today. Brian, do you want to say something about some of the workshops?
Yes, just very briefly, because we want to get on with today, but one workshop was on the development in hospitals, and I think that if I picked up the feedback from that session, that what hard work it can be to develop open dialogue in principle in hospitals, but there are different ways that people have gone about it. And I remember this question of top down and getting the support of management and chief executives and so on, as opposed to just getting on and doing it bottom up in a way and managing all the tensions and things that come about. It sounded quite a lively and much appreciated workshop, in a way, to hear about introducing open dialogue in hospital settings. Then I chaired a presentation, or gave a presentation, highlighting in just a few minutes the keynotes findings from the Western Lapland research. And we were privileged to have Jaakko Seikkula with us, who was able to respond to questions about the actual research. And I think what came across most in the discussion was the antagonism to the findings in many people, many people not wanting to know, in a way, and not believing it, and a lot of rather unpleasantness towards Jaakko and his team for for standing up and saying, look, there's a better way of doing things in a way. And
Mm-hmm.
we had some very interesting comments about the nature of the threat that this posed, and that this, the different threats that this poses to people predominantly practicing the neurobiological model. So it was a very full workshop with lots of participation from many people. Nick, you perhaps you do the training workshop in a way.
Mm-hmm. So the training workshop, I was involved in. We had I gave a brief presentation on some aspects, commonalities between training programs, and what I think is really important in terms of general considerations around running trainings. And then we looked at some of the differences between different trainings, a 1-year training and a 3-year training. And then there was an opportunity for everyone to sort of, well, many of the participants who'd been people present had participated in these trainings, and we started to talk about some of the differences, and also, what's needed going forward in terms of maybe a variety of trainings, but also coordinating trainings more internationally as the approach develops. And
there were 2 other workshops. One was to do with peer workers, which is becoming a much more prominent subject, the involvement of peer workers in services of all sorts, actually, not just open dialogue. And what I remember of the feedback that from that workshop was how lively and how emotional it was, the workshop, that people, as accounts of how much it meant to families and people experiencing psychosis to have alongside them in the networking teams, I think, people with lived experience, and how much it helped them. I think what I remember when I was doing this kind of thing was how much it reduced the sense of isolation and awful uniqueness in the way in what they were going through. So that sort of sense of linking. So that was a very important workshop. And then you're going to just summarize the last workshop, I think, Nick.
Yeah, the last workshop was on comparing open dialogue to other approaches, and we probably got about 7 chapters in the book, and we were able to include people who'd written 3 of those chapters, or 4 of those chapters actually. So Frank Burbach had written 2 chapters on comparing open dialogue to systemic family therapy and CBT, and Mario Ugster had written a chapter on open dialogue and music therapy. And then Claudio and Xavier from Spain had written a chapter on multifamily therapy. And what I'm remembering from that workshop, but also in another part of the day, was how the conversation that we had around how sort of fractious you can get with all these different approaches, and everyone thinks they've kind of got the best way or know the best way to run services, and how much there is, to benefit from sort of coming together and sharing, elements that we have in common and elements that we have that are different, and that can enrich the dialogue. And so, that was why it was important for us, I think, to have that chapter and to have that workshop.
Yeah.
Okay. So anything else from you, Brian, before we invite
No,
Jaakko?
I think hopefully that just makes people who weren't able to be here yesterday a bit less left out.
Yeah, good. That was the hope. So I believe that Jaakko Seikkula is amongst us, and Jaakko, can I invite you to turn on your video now?
Says that I can't open my video.
Okay, that's because of a setting that should have been disabled. So I'm just going to, Adam, can you sort that out? There we go. Nice to see you, Jaakko.
Nice to see you.
Perhaps Jaakko doesn't need much of an introduction, particularly to those who were in the workshop with him yesterday, but just to briefly introduce him as one of the original founders of the work that started in the early 80s in Lapland, that led to the development of open dialogue. And Jaakko worked for a long time as a psychologist in the service there before moving to Jyväskylä University and getting probably more involved in the research, and has been very important in terms of the research that's happened over the last 20 to 25 years. And he's also found time to support many new initiatives and training programs internationally. And I'm incredibly grateful to him for all the support he's given to us in the UK to get things going. So it's a real pleasure to welcome him here. Jaakko's going to be talking to us about his understandings and what's particularly important when working with people having psychotic experiences. And after Jaakko's presentation, we're going to have some reflections from a panel. And after that, Jaakko, you'll have the opportunity to respond to the reflections. So thank you once again, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share my ideas, and of course, all the way through thanking Nick and Martin of Brian the great job of editing the book of Psychosis and Open Dialogue. For me, understanding psychosis have been based on the same kind of approach for 30 or 40 years when I started to work. And in this respect, basic line for my work has been about the same. And this is very important also to mention, because we all know that at the 90s especially, there emerged this wave of reductionistic neurobiological perspective, which started once again to say that there is nothing psychological, it's all in our brain, and we want to focus on brain. And started to very strongly support the idea that psychosis is a neurotoxic situation, which means to be medicated, and neurobiological interventions are the core of the treatment, which has led into a very unfortunate situation in the care. But now, recently, we are on the way to coming back to the searching for psychological understanding for the people who are in a situation in which they develop that we call psychotic reactions in their life. And that's what I try to open from my point of view in the book, and also to share some of thoughts here. I'm sorry that I will show some slides in the beginning, so that you can only see me as in a small range. But okay, sorry. First, I need to come back, because I need to share this. Here they are. I suppose now they probably are visible. And during the last years, I can make a conclusion that the evidence-based medicine in respect of psychosis, and now I think evidence-based medicine that produced the treatment of excellence guideline, that for almost 30 years have based a very strong idea of the medication as a primary and all the other issues as a secondary. It really has failed to produce better outcomes in treatment of psychosis, and there is a lot of evidence showing that in 25 or 30 years, nothing progress has happened in meeting with people with psychotic problems on the whole. We have this very well-known study in Finland, in which we followed 19 years time those people who had psychotic, were in the open dialogue care 20 years or 19 years ago. And even if thereafter not being involved in open dialogue, or we did not have any control, the differences to those people who were in a treatment of usual, who came into the treatment 95 to 96 in Finland, is enormous. And in this part, I want to emphasize these figures of this treatment as usual, which were 1,763 people. And when you look at about these statistics, almost all were more than 1 month in hospital. After 19 years, half of these people have still active contact in psychiatric care. After 19 years, 81% are still on medication. And what is most striking, 61% are living on a disability allowance, disability pension. And of course, the statistics very different compared to the people who met in the first crisis, the open dialogue team. And what is important for me to focus that these statistics are about the same that we were used to think at the 80s, when there was said that people who have so-called diagnosis of schizophrenia, 1/3 may recover 1/3 will stay chronically, and 1/3 will stay in a situation in which they need to support. Nothing has happened in the core, in the outcomes during the time of these evidence-based medicine guidelines in treatment of psychotic problems. It's quite terrible conclusion, and I really suppose that society should react in this way. At the same time, within the mainstream psychiatry, there has started to emerge results that of research that show that there's really need to rethink within the mainstream also the understanding of psychotic problems. There is a very well-known research of Andreasen and her study group, who opened the frame to show that neuroleptic medication may seem to be related to brain shrinkage. There are several Finnish studies who have shown that neuroleptic medication may be related to increased mortality, especially polymedication if the people are in many medication at the same time. And at the same time, there are studies showing that other approaches, for instance, in Wandering study in Netherlands, they found that people who stopped the medication after 6 months, neuroleptic medication had better social outcome, even if in this Wandering study they were not informed what was the other part of the treatment, which of course is very important to realize. For me, when I think of psychotic problems, is to understand the psychotic behavior as a part of the psychological apparatus that we have to deal with extreme stress. Psychosis as a category does not exist. People who have psychotic problems, people who behave in a psychotic way, are not categorically different from people who do not have psychotic behavior or who are not behaving in a psychotic way. Actually, there are no studies that should have shown that some part of the brain functioning, some part of the genetic structure or should be different, so that only patients should have had and not people who may call normal. And it's thinking of the active response in this kind of crisis is very important to realize that psychotic symptoms, if we call them as symptoms, thinking of behavior in which we can define that it is psychotic, they are not symptoms or signs of an illness, but they are a survival strategy for the embodied mind to survive in strange experiences that are related with extreme stress situation in the life. The thing that we meet when we deal with people who have psychotic reactions, there many times, especially having a long time, this kind of, we can see very odd ways of behaving, and we think that this is the illness that goes, but it's more a kind of a psychological strategy for them through which they manage this very difficult situation. For instance, hearing voices that is all the time disturbing the situation. If you think more of kind of chronical situation, we easily talk or hear people talking that the illness is biting, as for instance in Finland is this kind of saying, but that's not the case. It's a long-standing psychotic behavior. Let's say chronification in this problem is a sign of failure in treatment. And the failure comes out of especially two respects. The first one is that the real meeting with people who have psychotic problems starts all too late, so that people really have a lot of time to create a survival strategies that are not constructive. Most part of the survival strategy is to isolate from human relationships, which is very risky thing in situation like this. And the second part of the problem is that if we have a non-adequate understanding of the problem and of human life, we may start to have wrong treatment responses. And this is what I mean, that wrong treatment responses is to think that psychosis is an illness that appeared with these symptoms, and we have to get rid of the symptoms, and we automatically start the medication without having a process to think who really needs the medication and who would be harmful for the medication, and for whom the medication would not do anything, or could not be for any help. Psychotic behavior is a response. We know already that it's much more usual than we have thought, and we know that main part of things that we think of as a core of psychotic experiences, like hallucinations or delusions, belong to the experiences of people who never have been in psychiatric care. So that most part of the people who really have this problem never have had any relation to the care. As such, having hallucinations or delusions do not need to be related to some extreme situation that may define that as illness. But it's really a response that we could need if we are in a severe stress situation. In hallucinations, for instance, people speak about real events that has happened as in one life. For instance, we know that a lot, not all, but a lot of people have been victims of some traumatic experiences. But at the same time, it's very important for me to realize that these traumatic incidents that people may have lived through are not reasons for psychotic. They do not cause anyone to become psychotic. Most part of the people who have traumatic experiences are not psychotic. It's a part of the response of the embodied mind that has happened now. But it's also important to realize that many times, if one has this kind of traumatic experiences, being a victim of a situation in which he or she did not have any control about, it comes out in the hallucinations many times. And when this happens, what is so important to start to carefully listen to the stories and guarantee that the voices are heard, and not at all going into the direction that sometimes it's said in the mainstream, to start to reality orientate by saying people that this is your illness and it's not reality. We never know what is the reality, and reality can really be very difficult for us to understand. I borrow here some of the ideas of American psychologist and psychotherapist Bertrand Picaret, whose texts were in the beginning of the 80s very important for me and for our theme to start to rethink the life of the people who had psychotic problems. And Bertrand Picaret used to say that creating hallucination is an active effort of the embodied mind to prevent something worse, to prevent death. And for him, it was clear that in hallucinations, people speak of real incidents of life, and they need to be listened to. And for him, it was also very important in his individual psychotherapy that the precondition was stop to neuroleptic medication, because he really wanted to be in the core of experience, people are saying. In open dialogue practice, what is important, there are 3 elements that I want to emphasize here that have become very important to include. First of all, when we meet with people who have experiences that we may name as hallucinations or psychotic experiences, is to have a relational focus all the time, which means that is to have a way of conversation in which we connect the experiences that people have in the relational context in which he or she is living. And of course, in open dialogue practice, we really want to work with the family, if there is a family. And if there not is a family, we really are focusing to creating new social relationships. And within these social relationships, everything is looked at. It happens both horizontally and vertically. Horizontally meaning that those people who participate into the meetings. And this is very important because this is the main intervention in the beginning to prevent the isolation that people have. Many people in their psychotic experiences have said that they want to have distance because they many times have a feeling that other people become too near of them. Or once one patient said that they come through me. And it's very easy to understand if I have a feeling that someone comes through me, I really want to have a distance that many times leads into an actions in which we start to be very nasty to create isolation to ourselves. And this is very risky. And what is needed to make an intervention for this, to stop the process of isolation. And for that reason, there is a very active effort in the very beginning in the crisis to invite the family members and other part of the social network. But also the relational perspective is very important to have present in a vertical way in the conversation where the family members are not present, or even if they are present all the time, to invite the voices of the other people. The way of inviting the voices is to ask for it. If your father would have been here with us now, what would he say? And in that way to create the voices of the others as a dialogue that is happening here and now. And in this way, there is increasing acceptance to each other. So the perspective of each other, against not isolate myself horizontally from the people who are present, but neither isolate myself from my images that I may have from the family relationships. And perhaps it's important to mention that we are not looking for let's say a real image. How do I understand my father and brother and father? But how do they appear in this very conversation that we are having here? The second important point is always to have a starting point to respect the experience without any conditions. Taking seriously everything that is said, and not at all to look at the pathological part of the experience, which for me is very important. I used to say that I have never spoken with a schizophrenia patient because I only speak with human beings. And this is actually quite core and essential idea. I do not focus on the pathological part of his experiences, but I really focus, and as we focus on a team, to understand his point of view, of course, together with the other point of views of the people who are present. And we all the time look at humans as full human beings responsible of their actions and serious in their actions. Even if it's important to realize that this experience may include hallucination, that is another type of observation about the lived life. And this is, of course, very important, let's say, diagnosis, if we use that term, that we need to do. It's very important that we recognize that people may have hallucination when they speak of experience that I do not understand. Because my response in this situation is different. The third point that I want to make in this very short presentation is to point out the importance of the feelings and affective part of the experiences. Many times when we are meeting in people who have psychotic experiences, they may also tell very extreme stories, and these extreme stories may scare the therapist, and they may increase our feelings of powerless, that we cannot convince, for instance, the one to understand that his paranoid thoughts or her paranoid thoughts really are real. And many times it seems useless to go into the debate if this really has happened or not has happened. But what has sometimes proved to be a way of dealing is to point out the affective experience at that moment. this has definitely been hard for you. Could you help me understand a bit more? How do you feel about this being present in this way? And then we can move the focus on this rational level debate of what is going on the emotional experience of feeling of how do I feel when I feel to be threatened. So having the focus more of the affective side of the experiences. And the fourth point is to understand the importance of being present here and now in the moment. And perhaps when we deal, it's of course being present in the moment, it's in whatever dialogical practice is a very important issue. But perhaps when we meet with people with who do have experiences in a form of hallucinations, it's important to realize that in our conversation, when people start to speak in a way that I think that there may be psychotic reactions, perhaps, and this is a kind of core hypothesis, at the moment we are dealing with the most important experience in his life, which is connected to that part of his experiences that is not possible to deal in any way because he do not or she do not have a story about it. And in this way, to respond, to be alert, to respond when someone starts to speak in a psychotic experience. And I've also conducted one study that was published 2002 in which we realized that, for instance, looking at the story of one who had been hospitalized because being violent to his mother. And the team was so occupied of the situation that happened at home that they did not responded his reflections about his behavior, that it's not allowed to hit someone. And in the second utterance, he spoke about his strange thought that he thinks that are not true, but when you do think a bit more, they seem really like to be possible to happen. And they did not respond to his reflection about his psychotic experience. And he never after spoke about it. So that we really can make a very radical choices in this respect. And it's very important to be alert and to respond and to say, wait a moment, what did you say? Can you help me understand a bit more when you said that you have a control of the thoughts of your neighbor? I also have some experiences, but not having time to go into this. In a very end, so I've been thinking that about the outcomes in the research that we have done. Why open dialogue seems to be so effective, especially in psychotic crisis, because we have most of the studies on psychotic crisis, even if this is very true in many other kind of crises. Picking up 4 ideas. The first of them is this immediate response. In many studies, we have shown that the duration of untreated psychosis has shortened into some weeks already. And when we know that in traditional psychiatry in which no crisis services are introduced, people may be psychotic 1 to 2 years. Some studies even say in 3 years before they come into the treatment. And of course, it's a very different to start to meet with people when they did not have time to construct a very strange survival strategy. And when we meet in crisis, we meet with people in their emotional and affective experience of the situation. And when we meet in this, there is much more openness, as Ian Fallon said, that the window is open to deal with the experiences that are connected with the psychotic experience. So it's our alliance to meet immediately in crisis in emotional turmoil. And for instance, it's so important to include the one who is psychotic in the meetings, even if we may think that she's very agitated, that could not deal with these issues. And instead of waiting that someone become more coherent to participate in the meeting, it's the opposite in open dialogue practice, to meet immediately and to be more coherent in the relationships with those nearest to my life. The second part is this relational context in having the focus on social network, because we reconstruct the life in the context in which one is living. And even if many times there is arguments that this family or this network has been harmful for the people, how can we invite them? But yeah, it's true that that in families, in social networks, bad things could have happened. But in coming together, people can learn new ways of behaving, and this is kind of reconnecting to the social network in people. Of course, this only happen if the key person wants the family to be included, but if the contact is made in crisis, it's easily to accept that. The third point is focusing on dialogues, because the meetings really are only for creating understanding of what has happened and not making intervention for changing the family or removing the symptoms. Having a focus on dialogue in the meetings, it's a challenging task for advanced therapists, for advanced clinicians, because we need to relearn. Now the process is taking place in a way that we follow the stories. Our clients are our leaders and not us as a clinicians or therapists as we are used to think. And the fourth point is that in applying this open dialogue has helped to avoid unnecessary medication and thus avoiding a lot of the harmful effects of the medication. And again, it's very important to repeat that the open dialogue is not a non-medication ideology by itself. The idea is not to stop medication and then start to see what happens, but the opposite, to make an active intervention in a psychological way, and then you have possibility to decline the role of medication. So these were my words to start with. Perhaps you will have in the conversation, you may have some questions and comments that in which we can continue the issue.
Thank you very much, Jaakko. So I'm now going to invite the 6 panel members to turn on their videos. And Brian, you can turn off your video. Jaakko, you can turn off your video. And I will turn off my video. And we'll then leave it to the panel. Now you have 15 minutes to share whatever you'd like to share. We have one new panel member, so maybe we could start with you, Michael, if you introduce yourselves, and then as the spirit moves you, share what you'd like to share. You're muted, Michael. And also just to say to those of you who are just joining today, you can see biographies of all the panel members on the website, but Michael wasn't with us yesterday, so he's going to introduce himself and then we'll go straight into the reflections.
I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who works in public hospitals, and I've had a particular interest in the individual psychotherapy for psychosis, and have written a book about that recently, combining CBT and psychodynamic approaches. So I have a lot to say about Jaakko's presentation, but I'll just stop with the introduction and come back with that later. So that's who I am.
Can I start? Is that okay? And I just thank you, Jaakko, for that overview and your thoughts, and especially the first part of the presentation, which I heard a little bit of yesterday. I mean, the results are so impressive. They're shocking, truly shocking, you know, in how effective open dialogue has been. And we spoke a little bit yesterday about the resistance to that, why people find it difficult to accept that. That seems to be an ongoing thing. I was really struck by your mentioning that the long-standing problems of people with psychosis, especially those that remain in hospital, are a failure of the treatment. They are iatrogenic. They are because they're on medication, they are in the system and they can't get out. And so, your emphasis on trying to catch people early before they fall, I think is key. And that's part of our open dialogue as I understand it. I don't know a great deal of open dialogue, but that for me, that rang bells, is trying to catch people early. But then to build on that, to actually form a relationship with the person. And in order to do that, there has to be a curiosity in what brings the person to their psychosis. And unfortunately, the history for me has been working in psychiatric rehabilitation hospitals, et cetera, is a lack of curiosity. When I first started working as a clinical psychologist, one of the psychiatrists, I was talking to people in a long stay ward, and he took me to one side and he said, "Alf, why are you talking to these people? They have an organic illness," and that was the end of that. It was like this curiosity wasn't there. So in a sense, it's this trying to get hold of this curiosity for me is key, and that to be a genuine curiosity, to hear somebody's story and to take it forward from that. And I think what open dialogue for me seems to provide, from what I hear and understand, and what you're talking about, is it creates a space where something can be spoken about and where something can be held, and provides a vehicle to do that. And that is something which I think is crucial and is very, very hard to do in the present systems that we have. And I'd like to try and understand how that can be opened out more. And lastly, just briefly, just to say that Ryan mentioned that in some ways there's a top-down approach to trying to deal with these things, or a bottom-up, so that the interventions can come from on high, from people who and I think I understand that's the way things started in Finland, or that people can try and introduce them as they're doing in the UK from the bottom and try and get into the system that way. And there's two different ways of doing things, and I'm just wondering about that. And so basically, those were some thoughts. And the resistance, my curiosity is the resistance to actually taking on board this way of working. I know it's a long-standing thing, because this thing oscillates in terms of people's curiosity about madness, in inverted commas. That's just some thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Jaakko, for your lovely presentation. And I suppose what struck me is how terrible treatment as usual is, and how little it has moved on. And I think the outcomes that we get are not so much a failure of evidence-based approaches, it's that evidence-based approaches are not being delivered in treatment as usual. And you referred to Toni Morrison's work on cognitive therapy without using medication. There's all the evidence about other family approaches, but sadly, I think what people still get in services a lot is just medication and somebody who visits them. That's about it, in a lot of services. And the waiting times are so awful. When you hear in the UK now, supposedly as a result of COVID, that people have to wait 18 months, to see somebody or a year. And you think these lengths of time are just unbelievable. Where is somebody going to be after 18 months or 12 months trying to cope, and the family trying to cope with the experiences they're having? So, again, the speed of response is, to me, just one of the most significant things about open dialogue, and such a relief for the family and for the person themselves that somebody's going to see them and listen to them really quickly, because that's when you need it in crisis. And as we said yesterday, that's when people are more open to help. So, the things we need, like involving the family and people getting cognitive work and help with employment and further education, it's just that we know that these things work, as does open dialogue. But for me, the sad thing is that they're just not being offered. And to me, it's the challenge is how do we make usual treatment better across the board for everyone, because it's just not acceptable really to have such poor services. So it's a real challenge. So in one way, your presentation left me feeling a bit pessimistic that things haven't changed. But on the other hand, as I said yesterday, there are lots of pockets of good practice, and it's how can we spread those more widely.
Can I speak? Sorry, I just wanted to thank Jaakko very much. It's the first time I've actually heard you speak, and I was very reassured. I guess I'm speaking from a carer's perspective, from the social networking perspective. Oh God, that was the wrong term. Social networking. I didn't mean that at all. Sorry. From the carer's perspective, I'll leave it at that. Family. Just to hear Jaakko say that hallucinations or hearing voices is not a symptom. It's a way of dealing with extreme stress. Just that very humane curiosity, as Alf was saying, as to what could be going on for you. That was certainly not our case when my daughter was ill, in inverted commas. She was under extreme stress, and there wasn't really any attempt to explain it. And I found that quite perverse and very difficult to deal with, being her mother. And I just want to pick up on some of the comments I've seen in the chat about how engaging with the social network can be very difficult if they do not, if they believe that the person is ill and unreachable and unreasonable and difficult, etc., etc. So there is this negativity in the family home, possibly. And I just want to say that, from my personal experience, when I didn't understand what was going on, I was making things worse, quite unwittingly, by asking questions or trying to get some narrative going, because my daughter couldn't speak or articulate clearly. And I needed psychoeducation. I needed to understand more clearly what could be going on. I discovered a program that is aimed very much at carers to learn how to regulate yourself when you're in crisis, because when you've got a loved one who is in crisis, that sets the whole family out of balance. And so I don't think you can underestimate the value of psychoeducation, but a very key component of the work that I'm involved in is actually equipping carers with skills. It's not enough to just have knowledge. You actually have to have skills to know how to engage in effective communication with the loved one when they are in this severe pain. And I won't wax lyrical, but I do feel that's a very strong component that's often missed. And when people are offered psychoeducation, it's not quite enough. It's one thing to understand, but then it's another to engage more effectively and to really truly support your loved one rather than care for them in a patronizing capacity. Thank you.
I wanted to make 3 comments on a terrific presentation overview. As somebody who does individual psychotherapy, I think that trying to fit that into the open dialogues approach, I see folks who have retreated into isolation, who aren't talking. They've kind of disappeared into their own world. I was working with a young doctor this morning who has a patient who is almost mute. He's reluctant to speak. And with patience and persistence, the patient told him this week that he's afraid to harm the therapist because he thinks that his thoughts can penetrate the therapist. And he wants to be a good man. He wants to be a good person and act in a moral and responsible way. So I think my job as an individual clinician is to open one dialogue, to start a small dialogue with somebody who is closed over, even though the ideal might be to do it at the very beginning before the person has retreated. Second thing, it has always seemed to me that one of the worst and most insidious things about biological psychiatry is the acceptance of a certain kind of pessimism about outcomes. So instead of, and Alf was saying this, and I think Jaakko also, that instead of the clinician saying, the patient hasn't gotten better, my treatment, seems not adequate to the task. Biological psychiatry says it's that damn disease. The biological messiah hasn't arrived yet. So our job is to be patient and try to keep people alive, but we can't really have any greater ambition. And this is something that becomes part of the story that young psychiatrists tell themselves about what their job is. They're not taught to be more ambitious in their goals and outcomes with patients. And the last thing, in terms of the obvious fact that the research is solid, clinical experience is solid. It's not like we need to figure anything out there. The principles are there, but it's implementation. And yesterday there was talk about get something started, and the efficacy of it will be attested to by family and patients. Kind of slow incremental growth of a positive thing through its essential goodness. I think that there has to be an arm of social action about this. I don't think that that's enough. I think laws have to change. So one of them, for example, is that in the United States, there's a law that psychiatrists hide behind, which is that the HIPAA law. You can't divulge anything about the patient, which essentially you can't have a conversation with the family. So this is an endless excuse for laziness and lack of curiosity on the part of the psychiatrists, because they just, well, I'd like to talk to the mother, but can't. You know, it's against the law. So that law needs to change. And it could change. There could be a different law. My own, I think everybody has a sense that we have to do what we can from our individual place, an individual point of view. Nobody can lead the entire charge. And my focus is on people who are training, who are coming into the profession. And I wouldn't say it's a lost cause, but with psychiatrists who've been practicing for 20 years, but that's a tough haul. But it's not so hard to get young psychiatrists, young therapists, young people interested in this method. So I think we have to play a long game to bring about the change that we're looking for. So anyway, terrific talk, and really very nice to be among kindred spirits in the whole conference here.
I'd like to add to that and say that for me personally, sometimes it's become a bit of a battle between the I don't know, normal isn't really a good word. The conventional psychiatric world and the world of open dialogue, where it's sort of like one versus the other, meds versus no meds. When I've sort of come to see it as, see it all as different tools that I can use in my own health, and that psychiatrists, like different psychiatrists have different different places that they're coming from, different models, and that even, and when I see the medication as a tool, along with the open dialogue, it can become a pretty effective system. It can, not always. I also just was, something else that came up for me was during Jaakko's talk, was a time when a friend called me in the middle of psychosis, and it was actually almost normal, or what someone might call normal. And it was just really interesting and comforting for me, because I've certainly had to call on people in my own circle in the middle of psychosis. And I've always felt a lot of shame around what happened there. But, this phone call sort of normalized it for me. And like we were just able to talk about it, and it just helped to have that experience with them. So those are some things that came up for me. I really enjoyed Jaakko's talk. I got goosebumps several times.
Okay, it's really difficult to have a dialogue here. I think we just have to have monologues, and but for me, the one of the most important things in open dialogue has been that we will not want to get rid of the hallucinations, but we want to listen to them, and there is a meaning why these kind of hallucinations are present here. So this has been something I've been following all my career in psychiatry, and speaking horizontally and being a nurse in the conversation when open dialogue is used is different. So nurses are sometimes earlier, at least in Finland, they were kind of like sitting in the corner and writing down what has been said or something like that. And in this system, everybody is responsible, bringing their views into the conversation, and I think this is different from anything else, and it's really nice to work that way also. And I know that families like that everybody speak.
Can I just make a comment on Michael, some of the things you were talking about implementation, Michael, that yes, we can have incremental change, but if you look at any of the implementation research, one of the things it talks about all the time is creating a sense of urgency. And anything that changes, you need to have this sense that, you know, it matters, that we need this urgency about it. And I think that's one of the challenges in the area we're in. How do we create that sense of urgency that we've got to do something faster than we're doing? And just another comment about, you know, the people who are in the system for a long time and maybe are a bit skeptical. I think it's really important not to write off the skeptical people, because actually sometimes they were young people who had ideas and tried and were beaten down by the system. And if you can bring them on the side, they have an awful lot to offer, because it doesn't, in my experience of working in implementation for a long time, it's not always that the young have these bright ideas and the older don't. In fact, a lot of younger people, it scares me that when I sometimes train students and their ideas are so rigid. So sometimes, as I said, those people who are critical, I found that if you talk with them and you know, spend time with them, that they tried in their time and they couldn't beat the system. So we need a critical mass of people. If you look again at some of the research I did a long time ago, 97, the way you get family work implemented is having a critical mass in a service or a critical mass in a team. And it's just a kind of, again, a suggestion, don't write off people. I mean, yes, there is a group who are like the Walking Dead and you might as well, you know, get rid of them. But actually, if you look at it in a grid, they're only a small proportion, and the others you can bring around. And just final comment on confidentiality. I know it's a much bigger problem in the States and in Canada. I did a lot of work training in Canada, and we had this, you know, radical individualism, and we were actually, you know, there were articles written in the paper because we were trying to challenge confidentiality. And of course, you know, the UK is the only country still that has a law which says we are obliged by law to interview family members and carry out an assessment of their needs. And as yet, that is still the only country that has that enshrined in law. So if we have somebody who says, you can't talk to the family, you say, actually, I have a legal obligation to do a carer's assessment, as it's called, a term you mightn't like, but actually that's very helpful. And I agree with you, if you can have, you know, if you can have the law change. But in the absence of that, we did a lot of training with our legal department to bring them along to the mental health training and to actually say to people, yes, there are certain things you can do. You can tell people that somebody is alive and well. You can tell them they're in a safe place. If a condition is known that you're talking about, it's not breaching confidentiality to discuss it. So we always use the line, if somebody says, I don't want my family involved, that's the start of a conversation, not the end of it. Anyway, those are just some reflections.
Thank you very much for all those reflections. And now I'd like to invite Jaakko to turn on his video again, and you can keep your videos on. And Jaakko, I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to respond to in what you've heard.
Of course, a lot of thoughts, but thank you for your very positive comments. And of course, I know a lot of the work that you have been doing also. Perhaps very small comments. One comment on the that was on the chat, and to Grainne about this evidence-based medicine. I did not have enough time to say what did I mean by this. These critics of evidence-based medicine. I was thinking of the system that is actually defined. How do you need to have a kind of at least 2 randomized clinical trials, and to have this systematic review and creating a kind of treatment recommendations, and that's what really has failed in the context of especially treatment of psychosis. In some other disciplines, not so much, but all the psychotherapeutic work has been outside because it's so difficult to do research compared to looking how the pills affect. And this really has failed, and it's really time to say it open and to challenge that. But I have nothing against to do any research, so that's not my point. And I know that open dialogue is one of the most evidence-based practice that I know, because it has been studied 35 years in the very valid clinical practice. There was a second question of Christel in the chat comment that did he understand correctly that I said that trauma does not cause psychosis? And my point is that not to include a kind of reductionistic thinking that once you had traumatic experience, you become psychotic, because our embodied mind is really working in a very mysterious ways. And that's the idea of meeting, to come together and start to create meaning, what has happened. And really to skip this linear thinking of the things, and that's the innovative, fascinating part. Because I've seen so many times that people, even with very strong traumatic experiences, have become a master in their houses again in a process of care.
Thank you, Jaakko. So we've still got some time before we go to a short break. If there are any other questions for Jaakko, you can turn on your video if you'd like to, and unmute yourself in order to ask the question. There's still 1 or 2 more questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just start with one from the chat, and then if anyone, while we're attending to that question, has a question, you can raise your hand or turn your video on and ask it afterwards. So there's a question from Robin. I'm wondering if you thoughts on post-traumatic growth or positive transformation after psychosis. That's for you, Jaakko.
If I understand that question correctly, yes, of course, definitely, yes. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of place of growth and development, even if some traumatic occasion has happened, so that it's.
Yeah, we spoke yesterday of there can be a breakthrough. It doesn't have to be a breakdown. It can also be breakthrough for some people.
Yes.
Yeah. Julia, do you have a question? If you could unmute yourself, then we will hear you.
Okay. I'm a psychoanalyst working with psychotic patients for many, many years, but I'm also a psychiatrist and give on and off medication. And I would be very interested, what are the conditions when you think of starting medication? You mentioned it sort of by the way, but I would be much interested on the situations which you consider appropriate for the moment, when you give medication, I find it a difficult question, and I'm battling with it for many years.
Okay. Yeah. Of course, when we started this research project, I yesterday told that this new medication procedure was started being a part of a Finnish integrated approach to acute psychosis project, in which one aim was to find the role of medication. And one part of the units, 3 centers, did not start the medication, but was expecting the other psychosocial intervention to affect enough. And only just after that, after 3, 5, 6 weeks, it was decided to look. So that perhaps, and I think that there is a point, very important point is this, that the medication, perhaps I'm now speaking of neuroleptic medication, perhaps could be taught if other pieces do not help enough. That's the point to think. But it's also a second point is to think about what harmful effects there may be, because the medication also can, in Finnish research, we spoke a lot about the grip on life. So people may have a kind of, for instance, hallucinations. And when they start off medication because of the sedative, but they can be actively involved in social relationships with their strange talks. But then when they are medicated, they lose this interest because there is this secondary effect of the neuroleptic medication and finding out those kind of very harmful situations. And perhaps my third idea is to a kind of conclusion that Dr. Birgitta Alakere, who was perhaps the psychiatrist in the world who most was used to meet with psychotic crisis without going into neuroleptic medication, and her idea was that in so-called negative symptoms, there is no sense to use this neuroleptic medication because it really is not helpful, even if we many times feel that so hopeless. Sorry not being able to give you any more precise response, Julia.
Thank you.
So if anyone else, I'll take another question from the chat, but again, if anyone else wants to turn on the camera and ask another question, we've got time for a couple more questions before we go to the break. There's one question in the chat, Jaakko, that's a question that I'm often asked, and it came up yesterday as well, is about the possibilities of working with people who have very long-term kind of challenges and have been on medication for a long time. And I know that you've been in that situation where you've done that work. If you could say something about that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. My clinical work, even if I've involved in studies of crisis intervention, my clinical work has been mainly with people who have been in a psychotic condition for a long time, and starting to work with their families, who has been very thoughtful process, and definitely it's possible. And immediately when we start, perhaps one idea only to share, when we start to work with this idea, took the question of could we go down to the medication? At the same time, we start to work in a psychological way. It's a very important part of this process. But I'm really seeing many, I'm almost saying miraculous things, but then I hear the voices of my teacher, Professor Jukka Aaltonen, who said that there are no miracles. There are psychological work that we do with people, and that's what I should say, that when people are met in the right way and listened to, they start to find use of their own resources.
Thank you. So maybe one more question.
Grainne seemed to say something. Your microphone is muted.
I was just going to say that was my experience as well. I just put on the chat there that it's never too late to start. Sometimes people think it is, but actually there are, as you said, almost miraculous things where you can reconnect with family.
Yeah.
And because they've wanted to be involved all the time. So it definitely is never too late to re-engage.
Never too late. My experience is that when we started after 50 years, one was psychotic, and that was very moving process.
Yes, yeah.
That we were going through.
Very moving experiences, yeah.
So I'm sorry we haven't got time for all the questions in the chat, but there's one more here I just want to ask. It's from Julie Dean Williams. Thank you, Jaakko, for an illuminating discussion. I was intrigued by your statement of psychosis as a strategy for our embodied minds to stage experiences. If someone experiences extreme trauma, another strategy could be disembodiment. And in time, the body speaks the mind. Perhaps then listening to how the body is speaking can be an important part of open dialogue.
Yeah. In some way, I very much think that in psychosis, our body is speaking, and it goes through the, or besides the, let's say, the conscious mind, so that so that in a situation in which we cannot think so clearly, our body is speaking in many ways. It forms words, but it also speaks in many other ways, like sensing and pain. And one patient, for instance, we had a group of people. We went to the swimming hall, and once we were in the swimming hall, she started to scream. I have shoulders. I have shoulders. I have found my shoulders. So that her image of her body had been lost so much. And then working in this warm water context, it was very important. Of course, it was not only that, but it was one example.
I know more generally in your work, you know, that in the earlier stages, there was a lot of focus on language and the words used. And as you've developed more in terms of the practice and thinking, there's been more of a focus on embodiment. And that's about everyone's embodiment in these processes. Yeah.
Words are important because they also are productions of our bodies. But it's exactly as you said. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jaakko, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you to our panel. Once again, I think 4 of you are leaving us now. So I think we have to say, in terms of that, maybe you'll be able to participate in a workshop, but you won't be able to participate in the panel afterwards. So I think that's Karen, Michael, Marjaana, and Grainne. Thank you very much for all your contributions.
Thank you.
And we will see Alf and Roan again with one other new member of the panel. And also we'd like to, for the panel that we're going to have after the workshop, if there is 1 or 2 of the participants that would like to join a panel to reflect on the workshops afterwards, then please do let us know in the chat. We've got space for 1 or 2 more people.